This is the second video on ions and ionic compounds, and this will be a short one on polyatomic ions. And I apologize, in the previous video I never actually defined monoatomic ions. Monoatomic ions are ions made up of individual atoms. The chloride ion, the sulfide ion, the sodium ion. Polyatomic ions are ions that are made up of more than one atom. And there are two types of polyatomic ions, cations and anions. You need to memorize all of the polyatomic cations. NH4 1+ or ammonium. That's the only polyatomic cation. For the polyatomic anions, there are a whole bunch. You won't have to memorize them all, obviously, but you will have to memorize a few. Now, the polyatomic anions tend to end in ate or ite, but there are three that end in IDE: cyanide, hydroxide, and peroxide. So if you see ate or ite at the end of the chemical name, you know there's a polyatomic ion. In a polyatomic ion, the atoms in the ion are bonded to each other covalently, so the ion does not dissociate into its individual atoms. Those stay, quote, superglued, unquote, together. The ones you have to memorize: acetate, and it can be written either one of these ways. The second way is the way a organic chemist would tend to write it. I am a trained organic chemist. That's the way I tend to write it. Cyanide, hydroxide, nitrate, hydrogen carbonate. Now this one actually has two names. The more modern name is hydrogen carbonate, but old farts like me sometimes refer to it as bicarbonate. Then there is the carbonate. Notice there's no hydrogen. We now have a 2- charge. Sulfate, phosphate. Those are the ones you really should memorize. There are also three ites that you should memorize: nitrite, sulfite, and phosphite. All you have to do is take one oxygen away from the corresponding ate, then keep the same charge. So for example, nitrate is NO3 1-, nitrite would be NO2 1-. So that's all I want to say about polyatomic ions at this point. So remember, monoatomic ions, the ion has one atom, whereas polyatomic ions are made up of more than one atom. Polyatomic ions do not dissociate when dissolved. You need to memorize all the polyatomic cations, which is simply ammonium. You need to memorize the polyatomic ions that I listed earlier in the video. And in the next two videos, we're going to talk about building ionic compounds and dissociating ionic compounds.